Alright, greetings everybody, and welcome to my continued series on Europe in the 20th century. This one is a little bit out of order. I had overlooked it when I was doing my series on fascism, the rise of Hitler and the Nazis, and of course any story of the rise of fascism is incomplete without Benito Mussolini. In addition, I think, other than being sort of, I guess, for lack of a better term, the grandfather, if you will, of fascism in Europe, coming to power in 1922, which means that he predated the Nazis by 11 years when coming to power. The other piece of Benito Mussolini is his rather bombastic character, and you know, if you watch film of him and you watch his mannerisms, it's hard not to sort of you know, find it almost borderline amusing that he had this sort of very intense cockiness about him and confidence. You know, some would say overconfident, but you know, to some degree I think that's what makes someone like Benito Mussolini quite appealing, because he's such a fascinating character. When we talk about fascism in Europe, it's a difficult thing because the fascists, whether we're talking about Adolf Hitler and the Nazis, or Benito Mussolini and the Italian fascists, or Franco in Spain, slightly different. They're all slightly different, although they follow the same kind of basic idea of, you know, extreme nationalism, anti-socialism, bravado, toughness, strength, those kinds of things. I think what makes this part of European history so remarkable is that characters like this actually came to power and became extremely prevalent on the landscape of European politics. So for our purposes, we're going to be looking at Benito Mussolini right up until the start of World War II. I'll talk more about the Italians and you know, their role in the Second World War when we get to my series on the Second World War, which I've actually already done. So for our purposes, what I really want to look at is what kind of conditions brought Benito Mussolini to power, and what happened to his regime, because at the end of the day he was the great inspiration to Hitler and the Nazis, and it wasn't long before the Nazi power overshadowed Italian strength and power. But right to his dying day, Hitler remained very committed and loyal to Benito Mussolini, even when he had dragged them into North Africa and effectively delayed the invasion of the Soviet Union, which from the Allied perspective, of course, was a blessing. But anyway, let's move right into it. But before we talk about him, I want to talk a little bit about sort of the background of where fascism comes from and what it's all about. So, or the roots of it. And I know the print is quite small, so bear with me. I'll read it out anyway, and hopefully you'll be able to make sense of it if you're just reading it on the screen. So the political roots developed in the 19th century with the ideas of social Darwinism and the writings of Nietzsche and Thomas Carlyle, his great man theory. Okay, let's talk about social Darwinism. I think this is probably the most important one. Social Darwinism was sort of a movement of ideas. Herbert Spencer, I think his name was, in Great Britain, who really perpetuated these ideas. Kind of, I guess the simplest way to understand it is social Darwinism became sort of a means by which people could justify colonialism and imperialism. Now, let me give you a context. So if Darwinism is about understanding the animal kingdom, how it coexists, you know, how species survive, you know, natural selection, the strong will survive, the weak will perish, and not only that, but how certain species change and adapt to their environment. So when you look at something like, you know, when Darwin was looking at the Galapagos Islands and looking at the turtles and wondering why did they have, you know, why did they look different, why did they have different shells, you know, and he came to the conclusion that it had to, it was largely determined by their environment, whether they were in a very flat open area or whether they lived in predominantly areas that were covered with lots of foliage and lots of trees. Anyway, we'll save Darwinism for another lecture, but the idea is that Charles Darwin was always talking about the animal kingdom. The social Darwinists said, well, why can't you apply those principles to the human species? You know, suggesting that some races are more civilized and better and stronger than others. And if the strong survive and the weak perish, then those who can take control of other civilizations or take control of other areas of the world should have the right to do so because they're stronger. This is the natural process. Now, from a 21st century perspective, this is pretty crass and pretty outrageous with our you know, understanding and sensitivities to racism and eugenics and all these kind of things. But at that time, there were people who were actually having academic discussions about this. So social Darwinism, in a nutshell, is a justification for racism, which then becomes a justification for colonialism and imperialism. The ideas of social Darwinism really came into fruition around the period of the scramble for Africa in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s, up until the period before the First World War. But social Darwinism is, I believe, a core idea of fascist ideology. I mean, certainly when you look at Nazi racism, you know, the early ideas, whether it be the Tool Society or what have you, these kind of organizations were rooted in racism and anti-Semitism. So social Darwinism, I think, is a real important primary source idea, if you will, to inspire fascism later. All right, let's move on. Growing democratic movements at the turn of the century, as well as socialist ideas, frightened conservative elites in Europe. Democracy or socialism were trouble. Okay. As European nations began to move towards greater suffrage, towards the end of the 19th century into the early 20th century, because so many European societies had become so industrialized, and out of that was a very significant working class population, the fear from some, particularly in the middle and upper classes, for democracy was, well, what's going to happen if it's one person and one vote, and the majority of our people are workers? They're going to elect working class, socialist, or communist, Marxist parties. And, you know, I guess from a middle class perspective, that was a legitimate fear, because the thinking was, well, my gosh, they're going to take my property, everything I've worked for. So the fear of communist revolution, or even socialism through democratic means for that matter, was a terrifying concept to people that, you know, either owned property or people who had savings or what have you. The fear was that they would be overtaken by the lower classes. So the fascists very effectively exploit people's insecurities about the fear of communist revolution or socialism. And it's interesting when you watch American politics today, right-wing parties and right-wing networks throw around this term, the extreme left, you know, the Marxists are coming out to get us. And it's amazing how that fear of the boogeyman, the communist boogeyman, is still a huge part of persuasion in right-wing politics in the United States, and even here in Canada as well. So, very interesting stuff. Fascist ideology had no marks, I'll explain this in a minute, and introduced no clear formulated system other than hostility to socialism and democratic egalitarianism. Fascism was largely improvised. Fascism was a knee-jerk reaction to these things, right? You know, the fear of socialism, the fear of communism, the fear of someone taking your property, the fear of someone taking your religion, those kind of things. So the fascists had very powerful things with which they could exploit to gain support for their political movements. Where Marxism had Karl Marx, you had the Communist Manifesto of 1848, which is really just a small pamphlet, or essay, I guess you'd call it, and, you know, something like, what was the other word, Das Kapital, you know, very academic, very, you know, heavy reading, but at least the Marxists had sort of a formula. They had a template, they had a structure, a lens through which they could look at, you know, the history of exploitation, the situation in Europe, and what can be done about people being exploited. The fascists never had that. They never had sort of a manual or a Marx, if you will. So for that reason, I think it was largely improvised. Fascist ideas received support from the middle and upper classes who feared political domination by the lower classes. Okay, so here you go. Now, it should be noted that most, well, maybe not most, but a significant number of communist parties that had been revolutionary in the mid sort of 1800s had moved more towards democratic socialism because they realized that their numbers were significant enough that if they just waited for that moment as European societies moved away from absolutism and more towards constitutionalism, that they would be able to gain and achieve their goals through the vote, I guess, at the end of the day. The Russian Revolution and communist uprisings in Europe after 1918 strengthened fascism's appeal for many because they offered stability from revolution. The Russian Revolution of 1917 was a huge game changer because now you don't just have these ideas and political parties floating around. You've got a major European nation that has adopted Marxist teachings and communist philosophy that claim to be, you know, the new world order. And so when you have that role model, if you will, the fear of communism just escalates rather throughout Europe. Fascists like Mussolini and Hitler played on people's fear of revolution and subsequent chaos and general insecurity to gain support. This is certainly the case of both Mussolini and Hitler. They understood the political landscape, they understood what was happening, they knew that people were afraid of communism, and all they had to do was you know, exploit that. I mean, you look at McCarthyism in the 1950s, it was the same thing. The landscape was the same insofar as, you know, you just got to scream communists and everybody ducks and covers. So it's pretty powerful stuff, and you know, out of that, I mean, fascism is largely born out of anti-communism. A lot of people don't realize that without the fear of communism, fascism would have been a very, very different ideology, since in many ways anti-communism was at the core of the development of European fascism. So fascists appeal to nationalist sentiment. We are Italians, we are Germans. Prejudices and scapegoats, finding people to blame, of course, is classic fascist activity as their targets, and portrayed themselves, that is, the fascists portrayed themselves as champions of law, order, Christian morality, as they did so powerfully during the Spanish Civil War period, and defenders of private property. No one will take your property away. We will defend your right to have property. So that's pretty powerful stuff, and hopefully that kind of gives you a context of understanding how and why fascism would be appealing. So, all right, let's move on. Come on, there we go. All right, early years, BENITO. Well, the history of Mussolini is a fascinating story. The fact that he was a very, very unruly child is well documented. You know, because when these individuals become leaders, and in this case dictators, and you know, people that knew him as a child will begin to, you know, write things about him. So there's no lack of literature about him through his school years, and all indication was that he was a pretty unruly child, I guess is probably the best way to put it. He was, you know, maybe not spoiled, but just he had a tremendous ego, tough guy, liked to intimidate people, that kind of thing. He was expelled one time for school for stabbing a student with a penknife, so as a penchant for violence as well. Interestingly enough, though, Mussolini grew up in his father was a devout socialist. Now keep in mind, you might be thinking, well, wow, how could that happen? That's as far as you can get from fascism. Socialists, you know, in this period could be just as dogmatic as conservative right-wing politicians, you know. When you are very passionate about what you believe in, you feel that your vision and understanding of politics is correct, your version and understanding of history is correct. So in many ways, you know, socialists could be equally as righteous and opinionated as fascists. But in this case, his father was a tough as nails, devoted to socialist philosophy. And he grew up rooted in these ideas. And so it's interesting how he makes that shift. In 1929, he became editor of the socialist magazine Avanti. Here he is an editor. You know, so many of these dictators started out in journalism, or for lack of a better term. Joseph Stalin was also an editor at one point. So, strongly supported Italy's entrance into war in 1950. This is where Mussolini makes that switch towards nationalist interests and Italian interests. And he moves away from sort of working class proletarian socialist ideas. He becomes, I think his sense of Italian nationalism is what really triggers his sort of fascistic tendencies. Now, of course, he himself wouldn't have understood that what he was doing was defining a particular ideology, because there was no, as we said, fascist textbook, but he was responding to the sentiments and the feelings that he saw in Italy, particularly after the war. Hated parliamentary democracy, so even in his socialist background, he would have had been taught to have a real negative attitude towards constitutionalism and democracy. All right, Italy in 1919. So now there's whole other story when it comes to the Italians at the Paris Peace Conference. You could look at my lecture that deals with that, but we know that the Italians were not given certain things that they were told they would get. In fact, when Italy entered the war in 1915, what brought them in the war was a promise from Great Britain and France that if they joined their side in World War I, they would guarantee them Italian-speaking regions of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which of course would be denied them, which is one of the reasons why the Italians, Vittorio Orlando was the leader at the time at the Paris Peace Conference, is why he left. And of course, when he went back to Italy and told the Italian people, we got screwed over, we didn't get anything, they betrayed us, you know, and then that combined with a growing socialist communist movement just 2 years after the Russian Revolution, Mussolini's looking around going, boy, there's a lot of angry people here, boy, there's a lot of unemployment and chaos, how can I mobilize that, you know? So he recognized the benefits of exploiting Italian nationalism. His big inspiration was this Admiral D'Annunzio, a poet and World War I war hero, who seized Fiume, a town in the north, with 2,600 legionnaires and held on to it for 16 months. He did this as a reaction to the betrayal that many Italians felt about the gains they were not given at the Paris Peace Conference. Well, if they're not going to give it to us, we're going to take it ourselves. Now, someone like Mussolini would have looked at the actions of D'Annunzio and said, wow, now there's a guy who takes care of business. I like that. 5 failed governments from 1919 to 1922, and rising socialist activity gave Mussolini a mission. So not only was there a tremendous amount of economic instability after World War I in Italy, along with a rising socialist and communist movement, democracy seemed to be kind of floundering. You know, and it was a relatively new experiment in Italy. You know, coalition governments had been a problem in Italy, and have for decades since this period as well. So he took advantage of the idea that it appeared that democracy was kind of not working all that great, same as Hitler did in the early 30s, late 20s, early 30s. Because he becomes, now it's a bit of a strong word, funny, I keep thinking I should change that, but that's essentially what he became. He became a thug, a bully, if you will, and offered bosses and landowners help in smashing socialist disruptions in their businesses. So let me explain this. He starts on the grassroots of Italy by recognizing that there were powerful interests, particularly factory business owners, that were very much aggravated and annoyed by the rising strikes and socialist left-wing activity in their places of business with their employees. So Mussolini says, hey, look, he starts offering his services. I can bring a bunch of guys with me and we'll take care of your labor problems. And, you know, it was violent. They'd beat people up, they'd intimidate them. And that's where the black shirts, later they become known as the black shirts, come out of. This sort of willingness to identify and help business owners with their labor troubles, if you will. And you know, and for all these Italian soldiers who had come back from the war, who had nothing going, who were traumatized by the war, looking for something to do, there was certain appeal in Mussolini's you know, black shirts, that hey, you get to join a team, you get to wear the same uniform, you get to be tough and intimidate. When you walk down the street, people go to the other side of the street, or whatever, the sidewalk. So it has a certain draw to a certain element of young Italian men, I guess. Given huge sums of money for his efforts, and of course, you know, you can imagine business owners are going to be extremely thankful for Benito Mussolini's actions. His black shirt movement is growing. He's becoming more than just a thug on the street. He's now getting noticed throughout much of Italy. He's given huge sums of money for his efforts, and he would later gain support from the King of Italy himself, Victor Emmanuel, Pope Pius XI, and the government. So why on earth, now here's the question, how could he go from being just a street bully to getting recognition from not only the king, but the Pope? What you have to ask yourself is, what is it that they had in common that they all were concerned about? Whether it be Mussolini, the king, or the Pope. And it's fair to say that the one commonality they all shared was their mutual disdain for the rise of socialist activity. And, you know, if Mussolini was going to deal with the socialist movement on the street, I mean, here was a guy on the ground dealing with it, not just through words in a paper, not just through manuscripts or writings or essays. He's actually on the street taking care of business. Then he kind of becomes the guy that they're looking toward, who can maybe solve their political problems. So by 1922, Mussolini's fascist party had over 320,000 members, 50,000 of which, by the way, were black shirts, were these street bullies. So you get black shirt organizations operating in all the major cities and towns of Italy, from the north to the south. So it's fairly significant. He demanded, now this was, some would say, a bluff. You know, he just threw it out there to see what would happen. He demanded to be made prime minister, and the king did not stop him or give troops to stop him because he feared civil war. When Mussolini says, I demand to be made leader of Italy, I think from the perspective of the king, or perhaps even the Pope, much like the situation in Germany, it was like, well, let's give this guy a try. He's pretty popular. He doesn't take any baloney from anybody. And maybe he will get our country back on its feet. You know, maybe he can get people working and make people feel good about themselves and be proud to be Italian again. I think it's a bit of a overstep to suggest that the king and the Pope were, you know, interested in the violent tendencies or the fascistic tendencies, but it was worth a try because there were just enough things that the Italian fascists were doing that had appeal to the wealthy, the middle classes, the Pope, and the king, that, you know, gave them the idea that let's give this guy a try, see what happens. Mussolini arrived in Rome by train and was made prime minister by the king. The March on Rome was a march, you know, through the streets, and we're gonna march on to Rome, and then we're gonna take it. Now Mussolini, of course, takes a train, but there were those that hiked for hundreds of kilometers to get to Rome, and then they'd all arrive together, and they'd make this big demand, big proclamation. You know, this would be a huge inspiration for Adolf Hitler when we look at the 1923 beer hall putsch. There's so many parallels, it's quite something. You'll have to look at that lecture another time. But the Nazis tried the same thing a year later, and Hitler was very much inspired by this action. So when he does get to Rome, the king appoints him prime minister legally. Okay, you're the guy, let's see what you got, see what you can do. Europe's first fascist had emerged, and he'd been appointed by the king. Now here's the interesting thing. Now Mussolini's got to go, oh shoot, this is for real. He's made me prime minister. I'll have to draw people into my party. I need people that are good at politics, that are good at economics, that are good at housing and development and the military. I mean, there's so many variables that are required if you're going to lead a country, and you certainly need to have a good knowledge of domestic policy, of economics, because if you don't, things can get very, very problematic. I mean, look at what happened with the Trump administration in the States. He didn't really know anything about history, and he stumbled on that, and he really didn't understand a lot about politics, and look at that another time too, though. But in the case of Italy, Europe's first fascist had emerged through the legal democratic process, if you will, of the Italian Constitution at the time. So he is now prime minister, but his fascist party is one of many in Italy's parliament. He had to move cautiously as his government had politicians from all the main parties except the communist and socialist ones. Many of the communist and socialist parties were very, very understandably upset that he'd been appointed prime minister. They thought the whole thing was a sham, and in some cases the tendency might be, well, we're not even going to participate in this process, because if you're going to appoint a guy like this, then we have lost faith in this. Now, the communists were not necessarily interested in democracy anyway. They had their own plan, but the Social Democrats, who were willing to work through the democratic means, found it extremely repulsive that this bully, if you will, had now become prime minister. The Acerbo law is an interesting thing, because now coalition governments are problematic for a couple of reasons. A coalition government, by the way, for those of you that don't know, is a government where a group of parties come together to agree to govern as a group, and then they will draw in all their votes, if you will, to form a party. And in principle, it sounds good. It makes sense, because then you can get the numbers, and then you can get the seats in Parliament. The problem is, though, at the end of the day, is you're going to bicker, and you're going to complain, and you're going to disagree on a whole bunch of stuff, and there's going to be a lot of infighting, which has been the fundamental problem with the Italian coalition governments. So the decision was made with agreement from the parties in Parliament, by the way, and I'm not too sure to what extent the king he would have had to have okayed this process as well. They established something called the Acerbo law. Now I'll explain this. The party with the most votes, over 25% of the popular vote, would take 66% of the seats in Parliament. So if you have an election and your party wins 26% of the vote, 25%, a quarter of the people voted for you, yet you have more votes than any other party in Italy, you're going to get 2/3 of the seats. Why did they do this? Well, I mean, to me, it's so that you can get the wheels of government going. You can get bills passed and laws passed and get things going, get things moving. The problem is, if Mussolini, is the largest party, then they are going to dominate the parliament. And you can imagine that their economic policies and their domestic policies are going to be rooted in their very intolerant ideas. So, 1923, a very popular socialist leader by the name of Matteotti was murdered. And, he was a threat to Mussolini because he was not a revolutionary socialist. He would have been more of a democratic socialist. His party was very popular, and I'd have to look to see the numbers. I don't have them here, how popular they were in relation to the Italian fascists, but he was deemed a threat enough that he was murdered. And what's interesting about Matteotti is that he had people beyond the socialist movement who liked him. He was very charismatic, good looking, good speaker, a seasoned politician. He had all the qualities. In fact, I would argue he had many of the qualities that Mussolini himself just did not have. So most believe, and I don't know if it's actually been confirmed as an absolute truth or not, but my understanding through my reading of history was that it is likely that the Italian fascists were behind his murder so that they could eliminate any potential political opposition. And much like the Rome Purge in Germany, which you could look at another time, gave the Italian fascists the pretense to declare absolute control by stating that there are subversives within our midst and we need to be actively involved in ensuring that the communists and revolutionaries do not disrupt our new Italy. So it becomes kind of a scapegoat. Mussolini did not react at first because he didn't want to come out saying, oh, good riddance to that communist troublemaker. He knew that he was popular, so he just kind of waited to feel how Italians felt. He didn't want to alienate his violent supporters, but did not, for fear of rather alienating his violent supporters, but did not want to accept responsibility either. Now, during that period in which he waffled as to his response, many high-level members of his own party were saying, you gotta take power now. Now's your moment. You know, don't screw around. Let's take power now. And basically, under pressure from the fascists, his own party, Mussolini declared himself absolute dictator, and there was no resistance. So much like when he declared himself, when he said, I want to be leader, and the king appointed him as a prime minister, he does the same thing in 1925, where he says, I am now the absolute leader of Italy. And he waited. Nobody was going to protest because the black shirts were such a significant force on the streets of Italy that by defying Mussolini and the fascist party openly, you know, you're looking at violence. You know, they're going to cause you grief. They're going to burn down your business. They're going to beat you up. They're going to do whatever they have to do. Like, these guys were tough as nails. They were bullies. They were seasoned bullies too. So fear becomes a very powerful motivator in Italy. Well, the thing is, it's all fine and good to use all these tactics, you know, and methods to get into power, but the proof is in the pudding when you actually become leader, because that's the point at which where you have to recognize that all the inflammatory things you've been saying your whole career really amount to nothing if you can't pull through and actually do good for the Italian people. You want to get them working, you want to get trade moving, you want to get the military going, you want people to be proud to be Italian and to feel good about the leadership, and Mussolini wants to be loved and adored. You know, that's his big thing. He had a huge ego. Although he was a profoundly insecure human being as well, which is kind of interesting. He had a real, hate would be a bit strong, but he had a very, very suspicious view, or he didn't like intellectuals. He was intimidated by people that really were well-spoken and well-educated, although he required them to run his government. He was somebody who really just felt insecure, and he didn't like feeling that way around people. He always wanted to be the center of attention. He always wanted to be feared and loved and revered. And, you know, but his insecurities were prevalent. And a lot of it had to do with the fact that he wasn't particularly tall in stature. You know, when he used to do speeches, by the way, I don't know, I should have mentioned it at the beginning of the slideshow, he stood on a box, you know, when he did a speech, because he always wanted to appear bigger and taller than his generals and people around him. So, you know, interesting character. All right, there he is with his shirt off, looking, you know, very manly, you know. There's even video of him wrestling tigers and things like that. So Mussolini's big thing was autarky, and once again the Nazis devised the same idea that it's basically autarky is economic self-sufficiency. We don't want to have to necessarily rely on a multitude of nations. We want to be self-reliant. Well, it's all fine and good if you've got the resources to be self-reliant, but Italy did not. So unfortunately, from a fascist point of view, if you're going to achieve autarky, then you need to take over the countries that have the things you want. So by its very nature, autarky becomes imperialistic and sort of rooted in conquest, I guess, for lack of a better term. he comes up with this idea, which I guess on the surface isn't really a bad idea, but it was poorly thought out and poorly planned, that if we mobilize our agricultural industry to grow one major crop, and we export that crop and sell that crop overseas, we're going to bring in all this money by selling this wheat. So he mobilizes the economy. But the problem is there are significantly larger and bigger wheat producers in the world that are flooding the market. Canada was a huge wheat producer. The United States was a huge wheat producer. The USSR as well, but I don't think they were exporting a lot during this time. That was during the period of Stalin's first five-year plan, so I don't think a lot of wheat was leaving the Soviet Union. But either way, there was enough on the market that he'd mobilized his economy to grow all this wheat and sell it, and then it didn't have any value on the market. They couldn't sell it because there's too much competition. So that battle for the wheat failed. For the most part, corporate interests were supported, hence workers were worse off. All unions were banned, which shouldn't be surprising. We knew that that was going to happen with his deep roots in anti-socialism. But, you know, his government did offer certain kickbacks, whether it be subsidized holidays or better pay for working people. So you can't just take everything away from the workers and promise them nothing. So the fascists did have to offer something in order to help people accept the fact that their traditional socialist parties were now banned. Public works schemes did, however, work. So, you know, his public works were very effective. You know, it's interesting when you look at this period, particularly when you get into the early 30s, that, you know, whether it be Stalin's collectivization or industrial path, or Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, or Nazi Germany's work programs, that democracies and dictatorships throughout the 1930s were implementing government-run public works programs. And that was largely due as an attempt to sort of offset the economic dysfunction that occurred as a result of the Great Depression. We'll look at the Great Depression another time, but so he did implement these public works schemes that were working. Iron and steel development doubled, or iron and steel production rather, doubled by 1937. So things were working. Well, one of the biggest issues in Italy was this issue of the Vatican, the Pope, and their role. To what extent, how much power do they have? And of course, Mussolini, being a profoundly ambitious, arrogant, me alone, you know, absolute type of leader, he has to recognize that the Catholic faith is extremely important to the Italian people, and that the Pope is a very, very important figure. And I think he would want nothing more than to come to some sort of agreement, because if you get to an agreement with the Pope that the Pope is happy with, then you've got the backing of all the Italian Catholics, who would be over the moon that there would be this détente, if you will, between the Italian fascists and the Pope in Rome. The background is the quarrel between the Pope and the Italian state began in 1870 when forces seized Rome. This is right on the heels of Italian unification, where they seized Rome from the Pope and made it the capital city of Italy. They didn't remove him from his, you know, from the Vatican or that area, but you know, making Rome the capital city was a bit of a problem for the Pope. 1929, the treaty resulted, that is the Lateran Treaty, resulted in the Pope recognizing the Italian state. The Church received compensation for previous seizures. So when the Italian state took certain property from the Catholic Church in Rome, they were given those things back as compensation. And Mussolini said that Catholicism would be Italy's official religion. So the Vatican wins, or the Pope wins rather, and the Italian state wins. The Vatican would become an independent state, with the Pope as its ruler. So the Vatican as a state was actually a process that occurred and developed as a result of negotiation with Benito Mussolini. So of all the things that he did, I suppose that's the one lasting legacy of Mussolini. Conflict arose, though, when Catholic youth groups grew more popular than fascist youth groups. Understandable. And anti-Jewish laws of 1938 were unpopular with the Italians. Now, I know I don't give a lot of background. It should be clarified that Italian fascism was not rooted in anti-Semitism in the same way that German fascism was. Mussolini implements these anti-Jewish policies very hastily in 1938 as a way to sort of appease Hitler and say, hey, you know, they were now allies, and Germany had grown far more powerful than Italy. And I think Mussolini wanted to say, hey, you know what, I'll do my part. And, you know, the Italian people reacted. They were confused and perplexed. Where did this come from? You know, we have lots of Jews in our community that are part of our community. So the Italians didn't embrace it in the same way that Germans did. But, you know, when we get to Germany, it wasn't that they embraced it either. It happened very, very methodically and gradually over time. So, all right. Well, for Italy, you know, he had this sort of complex, this Napoleon complex, some would say, but you know, he saw himself as sort of the new Julius Caesar. He was going to bring Italy the kind of respect that it had in the days of the Roman Empire. I mean, it seems ridiculous from a 21st century perspective, but at the time, you know, you tell your Italian people that we're gonna build ourselves up and we're gonna be big and strong like we were 2,000 years ago. There might be people who find that appealing. He worked with Britain and France through the 1920s, so, you know, he was equally as concerned about the rise of the Nazis and fascism in Germany well before Hitler came into power. So, I mean, I think this alliance here was just, you know, trying to ensure that Germany did not renege on any of her, you know, things like the Treaty of Versailles was going to be honored, and that, you know, these three countries are going to make sure that, you know, Germany was going to stay in line. 1934 is an interesting year because by 1934 Hitler's been in power for a year, and a curious thing happens in Austria where the Chancellor of Austria, I believe he was a Democratic, Christian Democrat, I believe was his label as the party, I'd have to look again. He was killed by Austrian Nazis. You know, and Mussolini was terrified of, oh my gosh, I can't have a Nazi state at my border, because he was, even though, you know, the development of German fascism was very similar, he still did not trust or did not like Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. In fact, when he first met Hitler, I think he said he looked like a painter, something like that. I can't remember what he said, but anyway. Mussolini would send in 3 tank divisions. I've read 4 tank divisions, but either way, he sent in multiple tank divisions to the Austrian border, and Hitler backed down. So some believe that Hitler was poised to move into Austria because he would have been welcomed, and he was welcomed in 1938 with the Anschluss 4 years later. But for Italy, the thought of having an Austrian Nazi government north of his border was not something that he was ready for in 1934, and Hitler actually backed down. Certainly in 1934, the Nazis were not in a position to be an active military force yet. So, 1935, after this event, he would join the Streza Front with Britain and France, condemning German rearmament. So, as late as 1935. He continued his alliance, if you will, with Britain and France to stop German rearmament. Yet, that very year, or a year later I believe, he openly went and invaded Ethiopia. That is a dreadful story, bringing in the tanks and using gas and on tribal peoples who were largely agrarian peoples in Ethiopia. It was a disgusting display. The reason he wanted Ethiopia was because two countries to the north and south were Italian colonies, and he wanted to unite them into this big colony. His long-term goal, by the way, Italy's goal, was to make all of North Africa and the South Mediterranean an extension of Italy's empire, if you will. So even though he condemned German rearmament, he openly invades Ethiopia. And at that time, I believe it was called Abyssinia. So if you're using a textbook or you're doing readings and you see Abyssinia, it's the same thing. He joined, though, the Anti-Comintern Pact in 1937 with Germany and Japan, which began his alliance with Hitler. This is actually a mistake that I should correct now, because in fact, what brought Italy and Mussolini together, if you will, as allies, was their mutual interest in preventing communism during the Spanish Civil War. And so they both get involved in the Spanish Civil War on side of Franco and the fascists. So, you know, without Italian and Nazi support, Franco may not have won the Spanish Civil War in 1939. And of course, the Allies, Britain, France, and other countries had a policy of non-intervention. So while we did nothing to help the Spanish Republic, the Italians and the Nazis went in there and carpet-bombed Madrid and Guernica. And so it was the Spanish Civil War is a really important part of this period of appeasement and all those events that would eventually lead to World War II. The Anti-Comintern Pact means Anti-Communist International. That's what Comintern is an acronym for, Communist International. So Germany, Japan, and Italy, a year after the Italians and the Nazis come together, form this triumvirate, if you will. And what brings them together? Their mutual concern and disdain for communism and the Soviet Union. So it really was an anti-Soviet pact and an anti-Soviet alliance that brought them together. Well, like I said, I'm not going to get into the war. I'm just going to give you a quick overview because I'm going to go through these details in greater detail, or have done already because I've already recorded the lectures. There's a 3-part series on World War II that I've got. So within that narrative, I've got quite a bit about Italy. So for our purposes, we'll just give a few quick notes. So June 10th, 1940, Italy declared war on France and Britain. Now, the timing of this is so important because I believe by this time France had fallen and things weren't looking good for Britain. So Italy says, now's the time to declare war when it looks like the war in Europe is almost over. You know, so it's pretty telling, you know. He didn't want to get involved in the war, but he'll take advantage of the fact that Germany's done all the fighting up to this point. The problem with the Italians, though, in declaring war was that they had no anti-aircraft guns and they had fuel for only 7 months. They were short of coal, rubber, and steel, fundamental resources you would require to fight a war. They only had 800,000 people in their army who were poorly led and badly equipped, so that's not helping Italy either. And we know, and I will get into greater detail, the North African campaign was a disaster. And, you know, so he, as part of that desire to extend his empire into Libya, Egypt, Morocco, Algeria, was to conquer that region. And of course, the British pounded the Italians, and of course the British were very concerned about Egypt because they wanted to maintain their lines of communication through the Suez Canal. So the Suez Canal was very important for Great Britain. And the reason Germany got involved in North Africa was essentially to bail Italy out. And because they'd taken a beating and they lost so quickly. So, as I say, we'll get into more of that later. All right, so that's where we're going to stop. And we'll leave it at that. So, if you're watching these lectures in order, I would probably watch the Weimar Republic, Germany and the Weimar Republic, and then I have 2 lectures on pre-war Nazi Germany, just so you can see the parallels between the two. So there you have it. All right, thank you very much. Have a great day. See you again.